The first project we're going to make on the machine is this little twirly edged color block scarf. For this project, you'll need 1,600 yards or 350 grams of fingering weight yarn. So these are the yarns I've selected for this project. I don't have a solid plan as to what order I'm going to go in. I'm just going to kind of improvise and have some fun with it and see where it takes me. You can have a lot of fun with this project. You can use all one color yarn. You could do two colors. You could get some really beautiful hand-dyed yarn that has little speckles. Really be creative. One yarn I selected was self-striping, so it's going to create its own stripes in the pattern. Since I'll be working with so many colors for this project, I'm going to get two of them threaded up on the machine, and then I can just swap one of them out as I go. For this project, we're going to cast on 140 stitches. You'll notice on the needle bed, it has a bunch of numbers over here. In the center is 0, and then the numbers work their way out. So we know from this that we're going to need to do 70 stitches on one side of 0 and 70 stitches on the other side of 0. Those will be the needles that we'll be working with. And we'll just use the needle pusher to push all of the needles over to the furthest position they will go in. Now we're going to go ahead and do an E-wrap cast on. We'll start with the gray color because that's my main color. I'm going to pull it off of the break on the tension unit and thread it through the carriage. There's lots of different types of cast-ons with machine knitting, just like there is for hand knitting. But we're going to do the E-wrap cast-on for these projects. It creates a nice clean edge, and it's a pretty simple cast-on to learn. To start, you're going to make just a simple little knot on your yarn, and then attach it to the last needle on the bed. Now that I've got that knot on the first needle, now I'm going to take the yarn and create an E-wrap on every needle down the bed that I've pulled up to the front. And to do that, you're going to take the yarn up to the right side of the needle and then down around to the left side. And then you're going to bring it to the next needle to the right, from underneath, up on the right side, down to the left side. Then from there, pull it over to the next needle to the right of that one, and etc. all the way down. So you're kind of making a bunch of little cursive E's all the way down the machine, just like this. And I'm pulling each of these stitches nice and tight, so they're right up against what's called the pegs, that are the little metal pieces that kind of pop up across the front of the needle bed. And you're just going to keep working in this way, going up through the right side of each hook and then down to the left side, and then you're going to keep moving rightward down the needle bed. So now that we have our stitches on all of our needles, now we are ready to start knitting our project. Here on the carriage, you're going to see that I have my color in the A slot in the front of the carriage, and all of my buttons are pulled out, so none of them are pushed in right now. This switch should be on N. The dial should be on NL. Now for this scarf, we're going to want it to have some nice movement and flow. We don't want it to be a rigid, stiff fabric. So because of that, we're going to change the tension that we're using for this project. So this is the tension dial, and it's going to control how tight the stitches are or how loose. And since we want our scarf to be stitched loosely, we're going to move this dial up to 8. If I wanted a stiffer fabric, something that was more dense, then I would turn it back down to 5 for this size 1 yarn that I'm using. But we want it floaty, so we're going to move it up to 8. So this is our row counter. We'll be using this in this project. So we're going to go ahead and rotate these little knobs to zero it out so we can start from the beginning of our project and start counting our rows. This scarf is really long, so we're going to need to knit up around 560 rows. And I don't have a solid plan for this piece, so I'm going to just switch colors whenever I feel like it's going to look best. So for our first row, we're going to move the carriage from the one side of the needle bed to the other. Now we'll take our cast-on comb and attach it to the stitches we just made to help add a little tension and keep them from getting tangled up in the carriage as we work on our project. I don't really need this extra little piece because this one section is long enough for the work, so I'm going to go ahead and put that piece away. All right, it's nice and stable, just hanging off of the yarn. So now I'm going to take the claw weights and attach them on the ends of the cast-on comb so it can help add even more weight to the piece. And we'll make sure this little latch is pushed down so it'll hit this little lever that will trigger the row counter and help us keep track of where we are in our project. And now we're just going to move the carriage back and forth across the needle bed for 560 rows. You don't need to push the carriage towards the back of the machine. You don't need to pull it towards you. You don't need to lift it. You just give it some good push from either side in the direction that you're moving it. That's all you need to do. Machine knitting, as with hand knitting, the most common problem I see, it comes from the tension on the yarn. So if your ball of yarn, if the yarn is getting like tangled up in there, or it's getting tangled up in the tension unit, usually when there's a problem, that's a problem that I find. So just make sure to keep an eye on the ball of yarn to make sure it's flowing nice and smoothly out of the ball into the tension unit and then down to your machine. So about every inch or so, you'll want to move your claw weights up. It's nice to leave the last little hook of it just sort of dangling off the edge of your fabric. It'll just help provide even more tension over there and keep it from getting caught up into your carriage. And you don't want it so high up that the carriage will bump into it when it needs to pass by. So you don't have to go too high, but you just want to kind of push it up every so often just to help add that tension to that edge of your fabric. Okay, so we've done 100 rows, so I think I'm going to go ahead and add in my next color. This is some self-striping sock yarn, so I would normally use this for socks, but I'm going to use it here to add a bunch of colors. It'll create its own little stripy pattern because of the way it's been dyed. To change colors, I'm just going to cut my gray thread. I'm going to take the end of the gray yarn that's hanging here, and I'm going to take that latch tool again and slide it in with the latch down, and then grab the yarn and pull it through and create another little knot here on the side that I'll weave in when the project's finished. So I'm just going to take my self-striping yarn from where it was parked on the yarn tension unit, slide it into the yarn carriage, and then use my latch tool to knot it onto the edge of our knitted fabric. I want to keep these ends of yarn out of the way so that they don't accidentally get caught up in the carriage as it passes back and forth. So I'm just going to move my claw weight and just kind of tuck them behind it so that they're out of the way. Don't be afraid to loosen up the yarn on your ball into a nice little small pile, just anything that helps it move nice and smoothly into the machine. If you want, you can do something like this. This was a yarn bowl that I 3D printed here in the Maker Lab. So I'm just going to take that little bundle of loose yarn and just place it in there to keep it nice and tidy and keep it from getting tangled up with other equipment that's in the case. At the beginning of my row, it somehow created this extra little loop of yarn. Must have gotten stuck on one of the pegs. Not a big deal. I'm just going to go ahead and make a little knot here, and I'll just weave in the end when I'm done with the piece. It is important to note that when you're working on knit fabric like this, anytime you're changing colors or something happens in the yarn splits or something, you always want to knot it on the end of the work. You don't want to do it somewhere in the middle of the fabric, because if it's on the edge, you can easily weave it in and no one will notice or see it when the piece is all done. But if it's right there in the middle of your knit fabric, it's going to add like this little lumpy bit that just won't look as nice. So now we've made it to the point of the ball where it's a center pull. So now I'm just going to put the little ball of yarn into my little yarn bowl holder, and we'll work from there. Okay, I think I'll switch over and do a couple rows of green now. So I have finished knitting my scarf. I finished it at 547 rows because I just felt like that was a good length and the colors were looking really nice and even. So I figured that's where I wanted to stop my scarf today. So now we're going to bind off of the machine. There's, as with hand knitting, a few different ways that you can do a bind off, but I'm going to show you a very simple one that's easy to remember that will work for many different projects. So how I'm going to do this bind off is I'm going to use my single transfer tool and hook it onto the first needle on the knitting machine. And I'm going to pull the needle all the way out, and that's going to move the stitch past the latch on that needle. So now when I push that needle back into the knitting machine bed, it's going to transfer the stitch over the latch and onto my single transfer tool. So now the stitch is on my single transfer tool, and I'm going to go ahead and transfer the stitch over to the next needle on the bed. I'm going to hook it onto that second needle on the bed. I'm going to pull that needle all the way out so that those two stitches now are just past the latch. And then I'm going to take my working yarn, and I'm going to pull my working yarn around the hook, and I'm going to push the needle back towards the machine. So that's going to leave me with a needle where 2 stitches have gone over the latch and have fallen off of that needle, and 1 stitch that will be secured on that needle in the end that is currently sitting on the hook. So now you can see how I work this across the bed to bind off all my stitches. It takes a little while to get used to using the transfer tool, but once you kind of get the hang of how to maneuver it, it can move really fast and it's very easy. Okay, now that I have finished binding off the work, I only have 1 little stitch left. I'm going to go ahead and cut the yarn and then just create a little knot for this last stitch. So now that the piece is off the machine, we just have to finish it off. We need to go ahead and weave in those ends. I like to use a tapestry needle. You can see it has a fatter eye, which is easier to get the yarn into. And you're just going to want to weave your stitches up and down the edge of your fabric. For a piece like this, you're just going to want to keep it nice and clean, really tidy, as close to the edge as possible, because it is such a nice, clean piece of fabric. You'll just want to remember to keep the colors next to each other. So I wouldn't want the green yarn to be woven into the edge of the fabric over on top of the pink or the blue. Instead, I'll just keep the green next to the green so it just kind of blends in and no one can even see it. And the very last thing you need to do is steam block your piece. So how that works is you use one of these steam irons that we have here in the Maker Lab. You make sure it's full of water and it's on the wool setting. And you're just going to lay out your knitting and then hold the iron above the knitting so that the steam can get into all the fibers. You're not going to want to put any kind of pressure. You definitely don't want to push the iron into the fabric because that will mess up the texture of the yarn and it'll fry the yarn and it won't look as nice. So instead you just want the steam to get in there, just the heat, and you're just going to want to pull your knitting in the direction you need it to. So if you want to straighten out any of the curled edges, you can do that by just kind of pulling them after they've had some steam, and then also just giving it a good tug. And that's all you'll need to do in order to finish off your garment and make it ready to wear.